The front door hadn't been touched in months. He could tell by the way the screen had warped slightly in its frame, by the thin crust of spider silk stretched undisturbed across the bottom corner, by the way the welcome mat, the same faded blue one his mother had owned for 20 years, had curled at its edges like something that had quietly given up waiting. Sergeant Elias Thorne stood at the end of the driveway and didn't move. He had survived 2 deployments, a collapsed building in Fallujah and a firefight in a mountain pass so narrow that he and his 4-man team had fought back-to-back for 11 hours straight. He had held dying men. He had carried them. He had learned over years of slow and brutal education how to look at something terrible and keep his breathing steady. But standing here, in the late afternoon light of a quiet Virginia suburb, looking at his mother's house, he felt something loosen in his chest that no amount of training had ever prepared him for. Max sat beside him, perfectly still, his amber eyes moving slowly across the property the way they always did when he was reading a new environment. The Belgian Malinois had been Elias's partner for 4 years. He had learned to trust Max's stillness more than most men's words. Right now, Max was still. Not tense, not alarmed, just reading. Elias let out a slow breath and walked up the driveway. Welcome back to State of Valor. The lawn had grown past the point of neglect and into something that looked almost intentional. Long grass bending gently in the September breeze, the flower beds his mother tended every spring, now tangled and wild. The mailbox at the curb was empty, not full and overflowing the way an abandoned house's mailbox should have been. Empty, completely clean inside, as though someone had cleared it recently, carefully, and didn't want anyone to notice. Elias stood at the mailbox for a long moment. Then he walked to the front door. The lock was wrong. He noticed it immediately. A high-end deadbolt, matte black, the kind with a secondary reinforced casing around the cylinder. His mother had lived in this house for 31 years with the same brass lock she'd never once changed. This was not that lock. He hadn't installed it. His mother had never mentioned it. He was about to pull out his phone when he saw it. It was small, barely an inch wide, scratched lightly into the wood of the door frame at shoulder height, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. A simple shape, a circle with a single horizontal line through its center. Elias went completely still. He was 9 years old the summer his mother invented their game. She called it field signs. She had drawn symbols on index cards and taught him what each one meant. Simple things at the time, a childhood game from a mother who always seemed to know more about the world than she let on. He had forgotten most of them over the years, but not this one. This one meant secure. His throat tightened. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the symbol, the way a man touches something he's afraid might disappear, and then he stepped back from the door. Max had already moved to the side gate. The backyard was worse than the front. The old oak tree had dropped a season's worth of leaves across the patio, and the garden beds along the fence were completely overtaken. But Max wasn't interested in any of that. He moved with quiet purpose across the yard to the far corner where an old rusted garden tractor sat half-hidden under a warped tarp, and he sat down beside it, perfectly still, facing Elias. In 4 years, Max had never once sat beside a piece of lawn equipment. Elias approached slowly. He pulled the tarp back. The tractor was old, genuinely rusted, the kind of rust that takes years to build, nothing staged about its decay. But when he crouched beside it and ran his hand along the underside of the front axle housing, he found a lever. Small, flush with the metal, almost indistinguishable from the frame unless your fingers were looking for it. He looked at Max. Max didn't move. Elias pulled the lever. A soft hydraulic release, barely audible, and a 2-foot square panel in the concrete pad beneath the tractor shifted and rose a half-inch on a pneumatic hinge, revealing a recessed steel plate with a numeric keypad. He sat back on his heels in the long grass and stared at it for a moment. Then, very quietly, he laughed. A single, short, disbelieving sound. Because he knew the code. He had always known the code, though he hadn't thought about it in 20 years. His mother had made him memorize it as a child. She had called it their emergency number. She had never explained why a family in a Virginia suburb needed an emergency number, and he had never thought to ask. He entered it now. The panel opened downward. A set of concrete stairs descended into pale blue light. The basement was not what basements were supposed to be. It was clean, climate-controlled, and quietly humming with the sound of electronics. One entire wall was covered in monitors, 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows, each showing a different camera feed. The front driveway, the back fence, the street in both directions, the side gate, and one feed Elias didn't recognize at first until he realized it was pointed at the road 3 blocks away, at the intersection where anyone approaching from the highway would have to pass. His mother was sitting at the desk in front of the monitors. She had heard him on the stairs. She didn't turn around right away. She finished what she was doing. He could see her hands moving over a keyboard with a precision and economy of motion that had nothing to do with the woman who used to type his school permission slips. And then she closed a program window, and then she turned around. Martha Thorne was 63 years old. She had her son's dark eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that panic was a luxury. She was not frail. She was not tearful. She looked at him the way she had always looked at him, with a love so steady and so deep it didn't need to announce itself. "You found the mark," she said. "Mom." His voice came out wrong, too rough, too much in it. "What is this?" She stood and crossed the room and put her hands on either side of his face the way she had done when he was small, when he was frightened, when he needed reminding that he was known and loved and not alone. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 210 pounds, and he had to work very hard to keep his eyes from filling. "Sit down," she said gently. "I'll tell you everything." She told him about Miller first. Corporal David Miller. Elias had saved his life outside Kandahar in 2019, pulled him from a burning vehicle under fire, an act that had earned Elias a commendation and cost him the hearing in his left ear for 6 weeks. He and Miller had served together for another 8 months after that. When Miller rotated out, they had lost touch the way soldiers sometimes did, the friendship real, but the distance too great. What Elias hadn't known, what no one had told him, was that when Miller left the service, he hadn't gone home. He had gone to work for a private intelligence contractor called Harrow Group. And 8 months ago, Miller had come to this house. He was polite, said Martha. She was sitting across from him now, her hands folded in her lap, her voice even and careful. He said he was an old friend of yours. He said you'd accidentally kept a piece of equipment in your personal gear when you rotated home, a small drive, encrypted, government issue. He said it was a simple administrative matter. He just needed it back. Elias felt something cold move through him. He remembered the drive, a small black rectangle, no bigger than his thumb, that had been in the kit bag he'd brought home.
He had assumed it was blank. He had put it in a box in his old bedroom without thinking about it. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, his mother continued. He smiled and left. That night, I looked up Harrow Group. She paused. What I found scared me enough that I didn't sleep. She had not called the police. She had not called Elias. He was mid-deployment, and she had made a decision, quiet and absolute, that she would not be the reason he lost his focus 10,000 miles from home. Instead, she had done something that Elias was only now beginning to understand she had always been capable of. She had built a perimeter. She had staged the house's abandonment carefully over 3 weeks, letting the lawn grow, removing her car, covering the windows, clearing the mail. She had moved everything she needed into the basement. She had set the cameras. She had secured the drive in a hidden partition in the wall behind the monitors. And then she had waited, with a patience that was almost inhuman, for Miller to conclude the house was empty and move on. He came back twice, she said, walked the perimeter both times. The second time he had someone with him. After that, nothing for 4 months.
Elias stared at her. "Mom, how did you know how to do any of this?" Martha Thorne was quiet for a moment. The monitors hummed. Max had come down the stairs at some point and was now lying at her feet, his head resting on his paws, watching her the way he watched people he had decided to trust. "Because," she said slowly, "before I was your mother, I was something else." She had worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for 11 years before he was born. Analyst work mostly, signals, pattern recognition, the quiet, unglamorous architecture of intelligence that kept the louder operations standing. She had left when she became pregnant. She had chosen him completely and without reservation, and she had never looked back. But she had never forgotten. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "Because I wanted you to have a childhood," she said, "not a clearance." He sat with that for a long time. There was a grief in it, not a sharp grief, but a slow one, the kind that comes from realizing that the person you thought you knew completely had always held something back, not from secrecy, but from love. She had carried an entire life before him and had set it down at his feet without ever letting him see the weight of it. He thought about every deployment, every time he had pictured her here, safe and ordinary and watering her garden. He thought about how that image had steadied him in the dark, in the cold, in the moments when steadiness was the only thing standing between him and the void. She had not been that woman. She had been something quieter and stronger and more vigilant than he had ever imagined, and she had let him believe in the simpler version because the simpler version was what he needed to come home to. He pressed his eyes for a moment. Max shifted and put his head in Martha's lap. The breach came at 2200 hours. Max heard it first, a soft change in his breathing, a lifting of his head, his eyes going to the stairwell. Elias was already moving. On the monitors, a single figure was visible at the back window, working a slim tool along the frame with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times. Behind him, a second figure was at the side gate. Elias looked at his mother. She reached under the desk and flipped 2 switches without hesitation. The strobe lights built into the exterior eaves fired in a 3-second pulse sequence, and the high-frequency emitters along the fence line activated simultaneously. Above them, through the ceiling, they heard the sharp crash of someone losing their footing. On the monitor, the figure at the back window staggered backward into the yard, hands over his ears. Elias went up the stairs fast and quiet, Max ahead of him, and it was over in less than 90 seconds.
Max took the lead contractor to the ground at the back fence and held him there with a stillness that was almost gentle, the kind of control that takes years to build between a handler and his dog. The second man was already on his knees in the driveway, disoriented, offering no resistance. Miller was not among them. But the drive that Elias recovered from the lead contractor's jacket pocket told them everything they needed about where Miller was and who he was working for. Martha made 2 calls from the basement. Elias didn't recognize either number. Within 40 minutes, 2 vehicles arrived with federal plates. They sat together afterward in the pale blue light of the monitors, the house quiet around them, the September night pressing softly against the windows above. Martha had made coffee, real coffee, from a proper machine she had somehow fit into the corner of her basement, and they drank it without speaking for a while, because some silences don't need to be filled. Max lay between their chairs, his breathing slow and deep, one paw resting against Elias's boot. "I used to think," Elias said finally, "that every time I deployed, I was leaving you behind to be protected." Martha looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I know," she said.
"You were never behind," he said. "Were you?" She smiled then. A small, real, tired smile. "No, baby, I was always right here." He reached across and took her hand. Her fingers were thin, but her grip was strong, the grip of someone who had held on for a very long time without anyone knowing. Outside, the oak tree moved in the wind. The cameras watched the empty street. And in the quiet of a house that had never truly been abandoned, a soldier finally understood that the front line had never been only the place where he was standing. His mother had been guarding one too, all along. Some of the most profound courage in the world is never witnessed, never decorated, and never spoken of aloud. It lives in the quiet choices of people who love something more than their own safety, and who act on that love without ever asking to be seen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who deserves to hear it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to State of Valor, because these are the stories worth keeping. There is significant educational value in this story, in its honest portrayal of what sacrifice truly looks like beyond the battlefield. It offers insight into the psychological weight carried by veterans returning home, the invisible labor of those who wait and protect in silence, and the complex emotional terrain of discovering that a parent is far more than the role they showed you. For older American viewers, it speaks directly to themes of generational love, hidden strength, and the quiet heroism that never makes the news, reminding us that valor is not always loud, and that the people who shaped us often carried more than we were ever allowed to know.